They say love can make a man mad. But what kind of madness makes a man wait for a woman who is already dead? He bathed her in perfume, wrapped her in lace, sat her in a chair and whispered vows into her still, cold mouth. Not because he couldn't accept death, but because he had never been allowed to touch life. This isn't a ghost story. This is history. A history so strange, so quiet, that no one dared to look directly at it. Until now. He was born into silence. Not the gentle silence of peace, but the heavy, sticky silence of a house where love had curdled into discipline. His name was Carl, a boy with thin fingers and wide eyes, always too still for his age, always listening for sounds that never came. His father spoke only in commands, his mother only in sighs, and in the spaces between, Carl grew, long and pale like a plant left in the shadows. He was not hugged, not once that he could remember, not kissed, not rocked to sleep, not cradled when fever took him. He was dressed each morning like a doll and sent off to school with a list of expectations and a heart full of frost. What he longed for was not approval, it was warmth. Just once he wanted to be looked at as if he were wanted. Just once he wanted to be chosen. But the world to Carl was a hall of closed doors. The boys mocked him, too quiet. The girls ignored him, too strange. And so he retreated. Not into books, not into dreams, but into something colder. A clockwork universe of routines and rituals, of objects that did not leave or lie. He lined up his shoes with mathematical precision. He counted his breaths before sleep. He cleaned his glasses every morning with a linen cloth and stared into the mirror, not to see himself, but to disappear. He studied medicine, not because he wanted to heal, but because the body at least made sense. Bones don't lie, muscles don't pretend. Blood is blood, it obeys. He dissected cadavers with reverence, not revulsion. Their silence felt familiar, their stillness, safe. He became fascinated by decay, not the rot of horror stories, but the slow elegance of entropy, the way flesh folded inward, the way time left fingerprints. He was precise, brilliant, unsettling, and alone. He met her in a hospital, Elena. She was young, sunlit, half smiling even in her sickness. Tuberculosis had chewed at her lungs, but not her spirit. She called him Dr. Shadow, said he looked like a man who had once been a ghost. He didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't. Instead, he listened. She told him stories, silly things, tender things, dreams about dancing barefoot in the rain. He nodded, said little, but recorded every word like scripture. She touched his hand once. Just once. And it was enough to rearrange his entire world. In her he saw everything he had been denied. Warmth. Light. A gaze that did not recoil. For the first time in his life someone had seen him, not as a strange boy, not as a pale man, but as a soul. Fragile, frightened, waiting. But Elena was dying, and that made her more beautiful to him. Not in a romantic sense, but in a sacred one. She became holy in her fragility. A light that flickered because it had no fuel left, and yet somehow burned even brighter for it. He brought her gifts, flowers, small trinkets, music boxes. He sat at her bedside for hours, reading her poems and anatomy texts with equal weight. She laughed at him, called him her philosopher of bones. She died on a Tuesday, and something in Carl's broke, not with a scream, but with a silence so deep it swallowed him whole. They buried her in a white dress. He was there. He watched the coffin lower into the earth and did not move for hours. The other mourners left. The priest left. Even the gravedigger went home. Carl stayed. Night fell. The stars came out. Still he stayed, because death had taken her. And Carl had never learned how to let go of anything that once made him feel whole. That night he went home and wrote a letter, not to anyone. Just words, scratched out in frantic loops. I will not lose her, not again. Not like everything else. This time I will stay. He began to visit her grave, first weekly, then daily, then nightly. He brought roses, music, whispered confessions. He sat beside the tomb and imagined her breathing, speaking, laughing. His love didn't diminish with time. It fermented, became potent, undiluted. Not love as we know it. Something colder, purer, obsessive. Months passed. Then one night, he returned with tools. No one saw him. No one stopped him. Because no one would have believed it possible. He didn't call it theft. He called it retrieval. In his mind, he wasn't robbing a grave. He was correcting a cosmic error, restoring the order that love had once glimpsed, but death had rudely interrupted. He arrived after midnight with the moon high and the wind quiet. The cemetery was a cathedral of stillness. Shadows stretched like arms across the marble headstones. No one saw him slip through the gate. No one heard the crunch of earth under his boots. But Carl heard everything. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought repeating like liturgy. Bring her home, bring her home, bring her home. The soil gave way slowly, respectfully, as if it too knew what was owed. He opened the casket like a man opening a letter from God. She was still there. Helena. Changed, yes. Paler, stiller. But in his eyes, not ruined, not gone, not beyond reach. He had studied decomposition for years. He had charted its pace, memorized its phases. To others, her stillness would mean loss. To him, it meant potential. He wrapped her in linen, carried her to his car like a groom lifting his bride across a threshold no one else would cross. The drive was long and slow. He hummed to her, apologized for the cold, promised warmth soon, promised music, promised everything. And he kept his word. He had prepared a room, not a lab, a chamber, half shrine, half boudoir. The walls were lined with velvet, candles flickered like the remnants of breath. He laid her on a bed of satin and began his work, not with scalpels, but with care, perfumes, powders, preservatives of his own invention. He whispered to her as he worked, each gesture as tender as a prayer. He wasn't trying to bring her back, not in the way alchemists or mystics might. He didn't believe in resurrection. He believed in preservation, in the sacred act of refusing to forget. In that room, time was a lie. Outside, the world changed. Wars raged. Empires shifted. But inside those walls, Elena remained. Perfect. Unchanging. His. He dressed her each day in gowns he'd bought from antique shops. He styled her hair, placed ribbons between her fingers, spoke to her as if she might at any moment respond. He told her stories, confessed his fears, read aloud the letters she'd never received, and when he kissed her cold hand, he did not shiver. He believed love was stronger than revulsion, that memory could conquer biology. And for a time, he was right. People noticed, of course. Carl had never been well liked, but now he became avoided. Neighbors spoke in whispers. Patients stopped showing up to his practice. A smell, someone said. A flicker of something in the upstairs window. A voice answering no one. The landlord raised questions. Carl paid in cash. He told no one the truth. Because how could they understand? To them, love ended with death. But Carl had never learned to let go. Not of a feeling, not of a gesture, not of a person. Especially not the only person who had ever touched him like he mattered. He called it marriage. He didn't say it out loud, not to the world. But in his head it was as real as breath. He placed a ring on her finger, said vows in the dark, and in his mind she said them back. People marry for money, for status, for convenience. Why was his marriage more obscene? Because it was quiet? Because it was still? Because it didn't decay the way others did? He couldn't explain it, not in words the world would understand. So he stopped trying. He disappeared further, shut windows, bolted doors, let the garden overgrow. The only room that mattered was hers, and in that room he found peace. But peace, like any illusion, begins to crack when held too tightly. One night a storm shattered the upstairs window. Rain blew in, wild and feral, and Carl scrambled to shield her. Water soaked the room, her dress, her hair, and when he touched her cheek to dry it, something had changed. She was softer, too soft. The years had been kind, but time, eventually, reminds us it still has teeth. Carl panicked. He lit more candles, applied more powders, recited old preservation formulas, but decay had found her. Slowly, patiently, it had waited for his attention to slip, and now it whispered its truth across her body like a second skin. He wept, not loudly, silently, because this wasn't just a body failing. It was proof. Proof that memory alone is not enough, that even love can't outwit entropy forever. But he would not bury her again. He couldn't. Instead, he tried something desperate. He began to photograph her. Each angle, each feature, each detail captured as though the camera could freeze time in ways embalming could not. He dressed her in new gowns, sat her upright, arranged the lighting. and took portraits. Hundreds. Thousands. Not for the world, for him. To remind himself of what he once had, of what he had dared to preserve, of what the world had taken too soon, and what he had refused to surrender. His work became myth. Rumors began to spread, that a doctor had married the dead, that a woman's body sat in a parlor like a doll, hair combed, hands folded, that he spoke to her still, that he danced with her in the moonlight, that her eyes somehow followed you if you entered the house. Authorities were notified. A warrant was issued. But when they broke down the door, she was gone. So was he. The room was empty. Only a single photograph remained framed on the vanity. A woman in a white gown, eyes closed, mouth smiling, faintly, just faintly, as if she knew a secret. No body was ever found. No charges were filed. But the townspeople never stopped speaking of it, not because of horror, because of recognition, because everyone, in some small way, has tried to keep something dead alive. A feeling, a moment, a love. Carl simply took it further than most, and in doing so, asked the question no one wanted to answer. What is love? When no one ever taught you to let go? They said he vanished, but Carl did not disappear. He simply stepped out of a world that had never made room for him, and into one he built from silence and shadows. There were sightings, of course. A man in a wide-brimmed hat walking alone down back roads with a bundle wrapped in velvet. A stranger checking into a crumbling inn and asking only for candles and privacy. A single red rose left at Elena's grave, years after the earth had swallowed her. But there was never proof. Only a feeling. A chill in the room. A stillness too precise to be natural. Carl wasn't running. He was carrying something. Not just her body, not anymore. He was carrying the story. The memory. The weight of what it means to love something that cannot return the favor, and to choose that weight over freedom. He found shelter in an abandoned greenhouse on the edge of a forgotten town. Ivy coiled through broken windows. The glass was cracked, the soil dry, but to Carl it was perfect. Sunlight filtered in like divine breath. The rot of earth mixed with the perfume he brought. He hung drapes, and he swept floors, and in the center he built her throne, a wooden chair carved by hand, draped in lace, framed by roses. Here Elena returned, not as flesh, but as ritual. He no longer believed in the body. It had betrayed him, betrayed her. It softened, crumbled, reminded him of endings. But memory could be dressed, could be painted, could be given form, even after form had failed. So he sculpted, out of wax, out of porcelain, out of hair he had once brushed, now sewn into a crown. He built her again, a replica, not a corpse, not exactly. A symbol, a shrine to love that refused to admit defeat. He talked to her every day, not because he expected an answer, but because in speaking he refused silence in the last word. He told her of the birds he'd seen, of clouds shaped like faces, of moments from their brief, impossible courtship that had rewired his entire nervous system. He didn't need her to respond. Her presence was enough. And in this greenhouse, time reversed. Or maybe time gave up. The seasons still changed, but only outside. Inside, it was always dusk, always golden, always still. But stillness cannot hide everything. The mind, left alone for too long, begins to bloom in strange directions. Carl began to hear footsteps when none were there. Shadows shifted even when candles held their breath. He started writing in journals, page after page of conversations he imagined between them. She was witty, playful, cruel, wise. She scolded him, encouraged him, asked him questions he could not answer. And some nights he believed she spoke first. He told himself it was memory, that he had trained his ears to recall her voice with such clarity it had become autonomous. But even as he said this, he felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. He began to dream of her standing over him, not as she was, but as she had been, alive, breathing, but angry. Her mouth open as if screaming, though no sound came. Her eyes full of a question. Why didn't you let me go? He awoke each time in sweat and weeping, because he knew. He had crossed a boundary even love was not meant to cross. Not because it was wrong, but because it was one-sided. A love without witness, a love that fed only on itself. What is love, when the beloved no longer gets to choose? He began to feel ashamed, not of his actions, of his need. The desperation that lived in his spine like a parasite, the ache that made him bend toward anything warm, anything that did not abandon him. He thought of his childhood, of reaching for his mother's hand and being met with air, of speaking and hearing nothing in return, of being told that silence meant strength, that feeling was weakness, that need was sin. And so he had grown into a man who built cathedrals out of memory, and placed a woman's corpse on the altar, because it was the only way he knew how to not be alone. He wept at her feet, not because she was gone, because he had made her stay, and staying without voice is not devotion. It is imprisonment. He stopped sculpting, stopped speaking, let the greenhouse crack. Mold spread across the lace. The candles burned down, and one morning he walked to the river, the same river where she once told him she'd dreamed of dancing. He carried a small box. Inside, lock of hair, a ring, a photo. He whispered one final thing. "You don't belong to me." And he let it float away. The current took it like a secret that the world was finally ready to forget. He returned to the greenhouse and found her, Elena, or the echo of her, sitting as always. But now he saw it clearly. The wax had melted slightly. The roses were brown. Her head tilted just a little too far to one side. And he said goodbye. Not with ceremony, not with words, but by opening the door and letting the wind in. He did not return to society. He did not write a confession. He did not make a statement to the press or leave behind an apology letter for future scholars to misinterpret. Carl simply stepped into obscurity the way other men step into daylight. He found a cabin in the woods, moss-covered, nameless, forgotten even by maps. It had no electricity, no heat, and no visitors. But it had what he needed. Silence that didn't accuse him. Space that didn't demand to be filled. And absence, pure, clean absence, where memory could finally breathe without turning into madness. He spent his mornings gathering firewood, not to survive, but to move. He boiled water, tended a dying garden, mended his worn coat, not out of hope but habit. In this small, crumbling world, Carl lived like a ghost that hadn't yet realized it had died. He no longer spoke aloud, not because there was no one to hear, but because even memory had grown tired of being summoned. The greenhouse, the wax figure, the photographs, the velvet dresses, all were gone now. Perhaps burned, perhaps buried, perhaps left behind for time to reclaim. It didn't matter. Carl no longer needed to preserve what had already decayed. Instead, he began to write, not about Elena, but about himself. For the first time, not the scientist, not the mourner, not the myth, but the boy who had once wanted to be held. He wrote in notebooks made of rough paper with a blunt pencil, shaking hands and no intention of being read. He wrote because there were things inside him that had never been named, only acted out, performed, mythologized. He wrote of the first time he felt invisible, of the first time he felt hunger for something no one had a word for. He wrote that love had found him not as a blessing, but as an invitation to destroy everything he thought he needed to survive. He wrote that when he kissed her cold hand, he wasn't trying to raise the dead. He was trying to prove that he still existed. But the notebooks weren't romantic. They were brutal. He admitted what he had done. Not just the unthinkable act of preserving a corpse, but the more dangerous act of rewriting her into something she never chose to be, of shaping her silence into permission, of mistaking his loneliness for destiny, of building a woman out of wax because he never learned how to live in the tension of being unwanted. And worst of all, of loving someone so much he refused to let her rest. He wrote these truths without excuse, without defense, and in doing so, something in him began to loosen. Not in the dramatic sense, but like thawing earth after a long winter. He began to remember her differently, not as his, not as a statue of salvation, but as a girl with a mischievous laugh, and a cough that caught in her chest like a whisper, as someone who deserved more than to be held captive by another person's grief. One morning Carl woke to the sound of rain. Real rain, not metaphor, not memory, just drops on a roof falling with the soft fury of forgiveness. He stood outside, let it soak his clothes, run down his face, fill his open palms. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply stood there and for the first time in years felt wet. It was enough. Later that year, a hunter passing through the woods found the cabin. Inside empty. Fireplace cold. Notebooks stacked neatly on the table. No sign of a struggle. No sign of a man. Only a line carved into the wood above the doorframe. Some loves are not meant to last, only to reveal. The hunter took one notebook. Read it. And told no one, because he knew no one would understand. But he never forgot. And sometimes, when the rain fell just right, He imagined a man out there still, walking beneath trees, lighter, nameless, forgiven by no one but the forest itself. But the story does not belong to Carl alone. It never did. There was another voice buried under years of stillness, lost beneath satin and photographs and wax. A voice that never screamed, never cursed, never accused, but one that should have spoken. Elena. She was more than the girl on the bed, more than the corpse dressed for devotion, more than a canvas for someone else's longing. And the deeper one listens, the more clearly her silence speaks. Because before she died, she lived. She lived loudly. She danced in bare feet across hospital tiles. She teased nurses until they blushed. She spoke about poetry the way most people spoke about food. She joked that tuberculosis was just another way to get thinner for free. And when she saw Carl standing at the end of her bed, stiff and terrified of his own skin, she smiled, not out of pity but curiosity. She saw the fragility in him and tried to offer warmth. But warmth, when it lands on cold stone, doesn't always spread. They talked, yes. She even grew fond of him. But it wasn't love. She never touched his hand with intent, never spoke of a future with his name in it. She was dying and the world had grown small. He was kind, attentive, strange, in a way that made her laugh. And in those last weeks she was simply grateful not to be alone. But gratitude is not consent, and kindness is not a promise. She didn't ask to be remembered this way. Not in wax, not in shrine, not as a symbol of someone else's salvation. Her memory deserved freedom, not captivity dressed as romance. There were no diaries left behind, no letters, no declarations of eternal affection, only the whispers of nurses who remembered her smile, the priest who heard her final confession, the sister who sat with her when the fever took hold. They spoke of a girl who wanted more time, not eternity, just time, time to live, to make mistakes, to fall in love on her own terms, to say no, to say yes, to choose. But that time was stolen twice, first by illness, then by obsession, and the world, in its hunger for myth, forgot her, elevated Carl to legend, made her an accessory to a narrative that was never hers, the girl he preserved, the bride he invented, the corpse he loved. But Elena was not an object. She was not purity incarnate. She was not a reward for a lonely man's devotion. She was a person, and if her soul lingered, it would not sit in a velvet chair waiting for him to finish dressing her. It would walk, barefoot, through fields, away from all of it. She deserved to be remembered as alive, with laughter still in her lungs, with light still in her eyes, with the dignity of her own ending. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the greenhouse cracked, why the wax melted, why the figure never smiled again. Because memory, when misused, rots, and love, when caged, becomes shadow. And truth, no matter how long buried, rises, not to accuse, but to remind that the dead do not belong to the living, not even when the living mean well, especially not then. And perhaps somewhere, in another world not ruled by grief, Elena laughs, free. Not because someone finally let her go, but because she was never his to hold in the first place. Carl died as he lived, quietly, unnoticed, and misunderstood. There was no obituary, no mourners, no family to claim his name. A forest ranger found the final trace of him, bones in an overgrown grove, wrapped in a tattered coat, clutching nothing but a single photograph pressed to his chest, not of Elena, but of himself, as a boy, standing alone, eyes wide, waiting to be seen. The image had faded, but the expression remained, that unmistakable look of someone on the edge of becoming invisible. They buried him in a public grave, a number where a name should be. But his story didn't die there, because stories like his never do. They linger, not because we admire them, but because they reveal us. Carl's tragedy wasn't just his love for a corpse. It wasn't the wax or the lace or the morbid rituals. His tragedy was more subtle, more familiar. He loved someone so much he tried to freeze her into perfection because he was too terrified to let her be real. And isn't that what we all do? We cling to moments, to people, to the idea of someone long after they've changed, or left, or died. We preserve them in our minds, not as they were, but as we needed them to be. We build shrines out of memory. We wrap silence in ribbons and call it love. We don't dance with corpses in our living rooms, perhaps, but we hold on to texts, Old voicemails, perfume bottles, pictures we refuse to delete. We scroll through their words and imagine what they would say if they still sat beside us. We say we're moving on, but we don't. Not really. Because grief, like love, is not a straight line. It loops. It binds. It whispers. And if we're not careful, it starts to speak louder than the living. Carl was not a monster. He was a mirror, held up to every person who has ever tried to love without knowing how to let go. He showed us what happens when the wound of neglect festers into worship, when the absence of being touched becomes a hunger that turns sacred. And he showed us the cost, not in horror, but in stillness, in wax, in the slow, quiet suffocation of a woman turned memory, in the solitude of a man who mistook control for closeness. And if there's anything left to learn from his story, it's this. Love is not preservation. It is permission to grow, to change, to leave, to live, even if it hurts, even if it means letting someone slip away into their own story, one you may never be written into. We all want to be remembered, but not like this, not embalmed in someone else's loneliness, not dressed in someone else's grief. We want to be loved and released, touched and trusted, seen and then allowed to disappear. Carl never learned that, but maybe we can. Maybe that's why we tell stories like his, not to marvel, not to judge, but to remember what love becomes when we stop asking it to breathe